For most of modern history, money actually meant something. A dollar was not just a piece of paper, it was a promise backed by gold, something tangible, something governments could not simply print into existence. But half a century ago, everything changed. In 1971, the United States quietly killed the gold standard, and with it, the last real limit on how much money could be created. That single decision, made by President Nixon on a Sunday night broadcast, reshaped every paycheck, every price tag, and every dream since then. What followed was not just inflation, it was a slow theft of purchasing power so subtle most people never realized it was happening. Imagine a worker in 1970 making $10,000 a year. Back then, that income could buy a home, a car, and still leave room for savings. Fast forward to today, and someone making the equivalent amount in inflation-adjusted dollars can barely afford rent. That is not progress. That is the cost of a system built on debt and deception. The truth is, the middle class did not get lazy or entitled. They got robbed by design. The government discovered that with fiat money, they could spend without taxing. Every time they printed, they were stealing a little from everyone holding dollars. Inflation became the most elegant form of theft ever invented. You do not feel it day to day, but over decades it destroys everything. The dollar you earned in 1971 buys less than 10 cents worth of goods today. That means if you kept your savings in cash, you lost 90% of your purchasing power without realizing it. They told you prices went up, but what really happened is the value of your money went down. And the worst part is, they convinced people that this was normal. They called it progress. They said the economy was growing, but what they never told you is that all the growth came from debt. The system had to inflate just to survive. After all, when your money is backed by nothing, the only way to keep it alive is to print more of it. This is why every crisis ends the same way: more debt, more stimulus, more printing. It does not matter if it is 1987, 2000, 2008, or 2020, the pattern never changes. Every time the system shakes, they patch it up with new dollars, and every time they do, your dollars buy less. The people at the top understand this perfectly. They do not save money, they save assets. They hold land, stocks, companies, things that rise when money loses value. Meanwhile, the average saver, the worker, the retiree is told to keep faith in the system. Keep your money in the bank, trust the dollar, inflation is under control. But the truth is, inflation is the system. It is how they fund endless wars, bail out corporations, and keep voters calm while quietly extracting wealth. Since 1971, the US dollar supply has exploded by over 30 times. That is not economic growth, that is dilution. You would never tolerate your company printing 30 times more shares and calling it success, yet that is exactly what has happened to your currency. And every time they print, someone pays the price. You do. You pay it every time your rent rises faster than your income, every time your grocery bill goes up, every time your savings lose value while the stock market hits new highs. The rich are not smarter, they are simply closer to the money printer. They get access to new dollars first, before prices rise. By the time that money trickles down to you, it is already worth less. That is the real trick. Inflation is not equal. It hits the poor and middle class first, while the elite profit from the lag. That is why over the last 50 years, the wealth gap has exploded. In 1971, the average CEO made 20 times what their worker earned. Today that number is over 300. That is not capitalism, that is financial feudalism. The game was changed, and most people never got the memo. And it is not just America. Once the US abandoned gold, the entire world followed. Every major currency became fiat, backed only by confidence and debt. And since then, global debt has exploded from less than $1 trillion to over $300 trillion. Think about that for a second. In 50 years, we have created more debt than in all prior human history combined. Yet politicians still promise free programs, central banks still print more. And everyone pretends that somehow this can go on forever. But it cannot. History shows that every fiat currency ever created has eventually failed. The Roman denarius, the French assignat, the German mark, all destroyed by the same pattern of overprinting and loss of trust. The dollar will not be an exception. It will just take longer because it started stronger. You might think this is all doom and gloom, but the point is not to scare you. It is to wake you up. Because the people who understand this game are the ones who profit from it. They know that when a system is built on fake money, real assets become priceless. That is why the wealthy buy gold, real estate, and productive businesses during downturns. They are trading paper for reality. And if you want to escape the trap, you must start thinking like them. Do not save in dollars, save in things that hold value when the dollar loses it. Learn how the system actually works, not how they say it does. Money used to represent time and labor. Now it represents trust in politicians and bankers. Once you realize that, you stop worshiping the dollar and start protecting yourself from it. The lie has lasted 50 years, but lies built on debt always collapse under their own weight. The only question is whether you will be ready when it does. Now that we have exposed how the 50-year money lie began, we need to dig into the second half of the story, which is even darker than the first, because this is the part that explains exactly how the system compresses the wealth of an entire nation upward into the hands of a microscopic elite while everyone else is left fighting over scraps. What most people never understand is that inflation is not an accident, and it is not a side effect. It is a mechanism. It is a tool designed to make sure that the government can spend without limits and that corporations can borrow without consequences, while regular citizens pay the price every day without even realizing they are paying it. When the United States abandoned gold in 1971, the rules changed overnight. The dollar was no longer tied to reality. It was tied to confidence. As long as people believed in it, the government could print as much as it wanted. But here's the twist that almost nobody sees. Inflation is not just a function of printing money. It is a function of expanding credit. When the government, corporations, and banks create loans, they are creating new money. So when you wonder why everything exploded in price from homes to healthcare to education to cars, the real reason is credit expansion on a scale no other generation in history has ever faced. You are not competing with other buyers when you try to purchase a home. You are competing with a financial system that is literally manufacturing new dollars out of thin air to outbid you. And because inflation quietly eats away at savings year after year, you are forced to either take on debt to keep up or fall behind permanently. That is the core of the 50-year lie. The system is designed so that doing the responsible things, saving money, working hard, reducing risk, actually punishes you, because the currency decays faster than you can accumulate it. But the wealthy do not hold currency, they hold assets. Assets rise with inflation. Wages do not. That is why the wealth gap exploded from the 1970s onward. This is not an opinion. The data shows it with brutal clarity. Once the dollar was unshackled from gold, asset prices skyrocketed in a way that was mathematically impossible under the old system. A house that cost 3 times the salary in 1970 now costs 10 or 15 times. College tuition that cost a few $100s a year now costs tens of thousands. Healthcare went vertical. And if you ask why, the answer is always the same. The money supply did not just grow, it detonated. But here's the part that makes this entire system borderline evil. The government needs inflation. Without inflation, the debt becomes unpayable. So the government has every incentive to let prices rise, because inflation silently reduces the real value of its debt obligations. But while this helps the government, it destroys the middle class. Your salary does not rise with inflation. Your savings do not rise with inflation. Your time and labor do not rise with inflation. Only assets do. And that means the system forces you into a rigged game where the only winning strategy is to buy assets before they inflate. But you cannot buy assets if you are struggling to survive. So the system traps the bottom 80% into a cycle where they never catch up. Understand this clearly. Inflation is not a tax, it is a transfer. It moves purchasing power from people who hold cash to people who hold assets and to institutions that create credit. Every time the government prints money, you lose a piece of your future without being asked. Every time the Fed cuts rates and encourages borrowing, the value of your savings drops. And every time inflation spikes, the gap between what you earn and what you need quietly widens. But there is an even more dangerous layer to this lie. Once a system becomes dependent on inflation, it can never return to stability. The government cannot afford stable prices because stable prices mean no escape from the debt. Corporations cannot afford stable prices because corporate profits depend on leveraging cheap credit. Banks cannot afford stable prices because lending slows down. The stock market cannot afford stable prices because inflation is the oxygen that pushes valuations up. So the system becomes trapped in permanent inflation, which looks like prosperity on the surface, but feels like poverty for everyone who is not already rich. And this is why the average person today feels poor, even if they earn more than their parents did. Nominal numbers lie. Real purchasing power tells the truth. The younger generation is told to work harder, save more, buy less, complain less, while the silent truth is that they are running on a treadmill that speeds up every year while the finish line gets farther away. And if you want to see how deep this deception goes, look at what happened after the 2008 crisis. Instead of letting the system reset, the Fed doubled down on the lie. They printed trillions. They cut rates to zero. They bailed out banks that caused the crisis. And then they told the public it was necessary to save the economy. But the money did not go to the public. It went to asset markets. And the rich got richer at a speed never seen before in modern history. The pandemic was even worse. The government printed $4.5 trillion in a 2-year window and told the public it was stimulus. But that money ended up in corporate profits, stock buybacks, real estate inflation, and speculative bubbles. And then they blamed ordinary people for causing inflation because they bought groceries and gas. That is the lie. That is the theft. That is the 50-year con. But here is the twist. The lie is reaching its end game. The debt is now so large that inflation can no longer contain it. The interest payments alone are spiraling. The government has crossed the point where it must choose between two impossible options. Option 1 is to let the economy collapse under the weight of deflation. Option 2 is to inflate the currency until the debt becomes manageable, which destroys purchasing power for an entire generation. And every signal we have today shows that they have already chosen option 2. That means what comes next is not normal inflation, but structural inflation, the type that becomes permanent. And when inflation becomes permanent, the middle class evaporates. Savings evaporate. Retirement evaporates. And the only people who survive are the ones who understand the rules of the game before the crash happens. This is why you cannot think of money the same way your parents did. Their strategies do not work anymore. Budgeting does not beat inflation. Saving does not beat inflation. Hard work does not outrun a currency that loses value every year. If you do not convert your labor into assets, your labor becomes worthless over time. The system is not broken. The system is working exactly as designed. But the design was never for you. The design was for the government, banks, corporations, and the financial elite who understand that inflation is a weapon and wealth is a game of positioning, not effort. So if you feel like you are doing everything right and still falling behind, it is because you are living in the final chapter of a 50-year experiment that is about to hit its limit. The next decade will determine whether this system resets, naturally collapses violently, or transitions into something entirely new. But whatever comes next, the one certainty is that the era of easy money is ending, and the truth that was hidden for 50 years is finally coming to the surface. And once that truth becomes unavoidable, the world will realize that the greatest economic scam in modern history was never a secret. It was simply too big for most people to see.